I remember that day as clearly as if it happened yesterday, though I've tried countless times to erase it from my mind. It was supposed to be a simple evening, a quiet night spent with the person I thought would always have my back. Yet within a single moment, everything I thought I knew came crashing down. I was sitting across from him at a small dinner party his friend had organized. It wasn't anything fancy, just a casual gathering, but I was excited to be there with him, surrounded by people we both knew. We'd been together for a while, and I felt secure. At least I thought I did. The necklace he'd given me hung around my neck, a simple silver chain with a small pendant. I wore it everywhere, like a reminder that no matter how rough things got, I had him by my side. As the night went on, laughter and conversation filled the room, and I felt a sense of warmth. But then, she walked in. His childhood crush. I'd heard stories about her before, bits and pieces of a life he'd lived long before he'd met me. I didn't think much of her at first. After all, she was just a piece of his past, a memory. But as the evening wore on, I noticed the way he looked at her, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long. I pushed it aside, convincing myself it was nothing, that maybe I was just being insecure. He was with me, after all. Why would I have any reason to doubt that? Then, I saw it happen. As I sat there watching him, memories started flooding my mind. Moments I'd buried, little signs I'd ignored, times I'd convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting. I'd given so much of myself to this relationship, sometimes at the expense of my own needs and dreams. I'd put him first, over and over again, believing that was what love was supposed to be. Looking back, I realized just how often I'd been the one making compromises, rearranging my life to fit into his. If he needed time, I was there. If he needed support, I was his rock. And whenever he got too busy, I made excuses for him, telling myself that he'd make it up to me eventually. I remembered a day when I had an important event, one I'd been excited about for months. I'd wanted him to come, to be there, to share in that moment with me. But when the day finally came, he texted me at the last minute, saying he couldn't make it. No apology, no explanation. Just a short, almost dismissive message. I was crushed, but I told myself he'd probably had a good reason. After all, he was my boyfriend. He cared about me, didn't he? There were so many moments like that, where I put my own feelings aside, letting him take up all the space in the relationship. I even started to doubt my own worth, wondering if maybe I was asking too much. I convinced myself that my needs weren't as important, that my happiness could wait. But here's the thing about waiting. It wears on you. Bit by bit, I felt myself growing smaller, quieter, as if I was shrinking into the shadows just to keep him happy. My friends noticed it too. They'd ask why I wasn't going out as much, why I looked so tired. I always brushed it off, not wanting to admit that I was giving so much of myself to someone who barely noticed. And still, through all of this, I wore that necklace, the one he'd given me on our anniversary. It felt like a symbol of our bond, something to hold on to whenever I doubted if we'd make it. Whenever I felt alone, I'd reach up and touch it, reminding myself that I was loved even if he didn't always show it. But now, watching him with her, that necklace felt heavier, like a weight pulling me down, suffocating me. The realization hit hard. I'd given him so much of myself that I'd lost sight of who I was. And here he was, smiling, laughing, as if none of it mattered, as if I didn't matter. It was as if I was finally seeing clearly for the first time, seeing all the little ways I'd been pushed aside, made to feel invisible. And now, the one thing I'd clung to, this necklace he'd given me, was nothing more than a hollow gesture. A reminder of all the love and effort I'd poured into someone who saw me as an afterthought. In that moment, sitting in that crowded room with laughter ringing in my ears, I realized something painful but true. I had spent so much of my energy building him up that I'd forgotten to take care of myself. I tried to shake off the feeling, to convince myself that I was just overthinking things. But as I watched him lean in close to her, laughing at something she said, I couldn't ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Then she pointed to my necklace, the necklace he'd given me, and asked where he'd found it. I was taken aback, confused. Why would she ask that? And then, he answered. "Oh, this," he said, reaching over as if to touch the pendant that rested against her skin, even though it was around my neck. "I actually bought it a long time ago, back when we were kids. I guess I was holding on to it for you." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I just heard. Holding on to it? For her? No, that couldn't be right. He had given it to me, hadn't he? It was our anniversary gift, something he'd said was meant just for me. But as he smiled at her, there was no mistaking it. The words had come out naturally, almost effortlessly, as if this story was the truth, as if I wasn't even sitting there, as if I hadn't spent all this time believing in something that was never real. I felt my heart break, piece by piece, each word chipping away at the foundation of everything I thought we had. My hands trembled, and for a moment I wanted to scream, to confront him right then and there. But I felt frozen, paralyzed by the realization that the man I'd loved so completely, the man I'd given my heart to, was looking at someone else as if she was the only one who mattered. I looked down at the necklace, feeling its weight against my chest, and the memory of how happy I'd been when he'd given it to me came flooding back. I'd thought it was a symbol of his love, a sign that he wanted a future with me. But now, in this room, surrounded by strangers, it felt like a cheap lie, a hollow gesture. He hadn't given it to me because he loved me. He'd given it to me because she wasn't there. I wanted to walk out, to leave before anyone noticed the tears welling up in my eyes. But I stayed, rooted to the spot, clinging to some small shred of hope that he'd realize what he was doing, that he'd look at me and see the hurt in my eyes. But he didn't. Instead, he kept talking to her, sharing stories, laughing, acting as if I wasn't even there. It was like watching someone else's life unfold. A life I wasn't a part of, a life where I was just a spectator. And in that moment, something inside me broke. I realized that I had been holding on to a version of him that didn't exist anymore, if it ever had at all. I had built him up in my mind, convinced myself that he was the one, that he was worth every sacrifice, every compromise. But now, as I watched him with her, I saw the truth, that I had been nothing more than a placeholder, someone he kept around until something better came along. I felt a surge of anger, a raw, burning fury that I had never felt before. I wanted to grab him, to make him see what he was doing, to demand an explanation. But I knew, deep down, that no explanation would ever be enough. There was no excuse he could give, no apology he could make that would take away the pain of that betrayal. So I did the only thing I could do. I stayed silent, watching him, letting the reality of what I'd lost sink in. I knew then that this was the end, that whatever we'd had was gone, burned away by the flames of his indifference. After that night, I couldn't shake the emptiness that had settled deep within me. The image of him with her, laughing, sharing secrets, moments that should have been ours, played over and over in my mind. I kept asking myself, how could he do this? But no matter how much I replayed the scene, I was left with only one answer. He had made a choice. A choice that didn't include me. For days, I tried to make sense of it, to find some way to justify his actions, to find a reason that would make the pain go away. But as I sat alone in my apartment, the reality sank in. I realized that there was no justification, no excuse. The more I tried to rationalize it, the clearer it became. He didn't see me as a priority. I was the one clinging to a love that didn't value me in return. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought crept into my mind. What if I didn't need him to feel complete? The idea was foreign, almost unsettling, but it lingered, refusing to let go. I'd spent so much time defining myself by his presence, by his approval, that I hadn't stopped to consider what I wanted, who I wanted to be. I got out of bed, walked over to the mirror, and looked at myself, really looked at myself, for the first time in what felt like years. I saw someone tired, worn down, almost unrecognizable, someone who had given everything to someone who couldn't even see her worth. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized I had a choice too. I didn't have to stay in a relationship that left me feeling empty. I didn't have to accept crumbs of affection from someone who couldn't even be honest with me. For the first time, I felt a surge of strength, a quiet but undeniable voice inside me saying, "You deserve more." I walked over to my jewelry box, opened it, and took out the necklace he'd given me. I held it in my hand, feeling its weight, the memories it once held. But now it felt like a chain holding me back, a reminder of a love that had only taken from me without giving anything real in return. I knew what I had to do. With a steady hand, I unclasped the necklace and let it fall onto the dresser. Watching it lie there, cold and lifeless, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It was a small act, but it felt monumental, like the first step toward reclaiming my life. I didn't have to stay in the shadows, constantly waiting for someone to make room for me. I was done being the one who sacrificed, the one who waited, the one who gave everything without receiving anything in return. I was ready to be seen, to be valued, to stand up for myself. That night, I made a decision. I would no longer be defined by someone else's choices. I was going to redefine my own path, to create a life that didn't rely on anyone else's approval or affection. I was done being the silent, invisible woman in someone else's story. I was ready to be the hero in my own. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in ages. There was no more confusion, no more wondering. I knew what I had to do. This was my life, and I was done letting someone else dictate my worth. I texted him, asking if we could meet. He replied right away, agreeing to see me later that day. Part of me felt nervous. My heart was pounding, my palms were sweaty, but beneath the anxiety was a newfound strength. I was no longer the same person he'd taken for granted. I was no longer the girl who'd silently watched from the sidelines, waiting for him to see her. When I arrived at the cafe, he was already there, sitting at a table by the window, scrolling through his phone. As I approached, he looked up and smiled, as if nothing was wrong, as if the world hadn't shifted beneath my feet just days before. "Hey," he said casually. "Everything okay?" His tone was so nonchalant, so unbothered, that I felt a rush of anger rise up in me. But I kept my composure, took a deep breath, and sat down across from him. "No," I replied, my voice steady, unwavering. "Everything is not okay." He looked at me, confused, maybe even a bit defensive. "What's wrong?" I took a moment, gathering my thoughts, letting the weight of my words sink in before I spoke. "You know what's wrong," I said, meeting his gaze. "You chose her. You made me believe that I mattered to you, that I was special, and then you handed her the one thing that was supposed to mean something between us. Do you have any idea how that felt?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of guilt cross his face. He stammered, trying to come up with an explanation, but I held up my hand, stopping him. "No," I continued, "you don't get to make excuses. You don't get to say you're sorry and expect everything to go back to normal, because it won't. It can't. I won't let it." He opened his mouth to speak, but I wasn't done. "For so long I made excuses for you. I let you be the center of my life, thinking that somehow one day you'd do the same for me, but I was wrong. I was living in an illusion, holding on to something that wasn't real, and I'm done." I saw him look away, his shoulders slumping, as if he finally realized the depth of what he'd done. But I didn't feel pity. I felt liberated, stronger, as if I was finally reclaiming a part of myself that I'd given away too easily. "This is goodbye," I said, my voice calm, almost serene. "I deserve someone who will see me, value me, and never make me feel like I'm not enough. And I know now that person isn't you." He looked at me, a mixture of shock and regret in his eyes, but I didn't let it sway me. I was no longer the woman who needed his validation, his approval. I was done waiting, done hoping. I was ready to move forward without him. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in months. The necklace I'd once cherished was gone, left behind as a symbol of the past I was leaving behind. And as I walked out of the cafe, I felt a surge of freedom, a sense of empowerment that filled me with new energy. This was my moment, the beginning of a new chapter. And I knew, deep down, that I'd never look back. The days that followed felt surreal, as if I was seeing the world through new eyes. Everything seemed clearer, sharper, like a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying had finally been lifted. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow. I wasn't waiting for someone to see me, to love me, to make me feel whole. I started filling my days with things that were just for me. I went back to hobbies I'd once loved but had set aside. Painting, reading, long walks through the park. Each day, I rediscovered small parts of myself I'd forgotten, pieces that had been buried under years of compromise and sacrifice. I was no longer defining myself by someone else's needs, someone else's happiness. I was living for me. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet peace settle within me. It was strange, this feeling of calm, this sense of wholeness that I hadn't experienced in so long. I thought about everything I'd been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the realization that I'd been living in an illusion. And yet, as painful as it had been, I felt grateful. Grateful for the lessons, for the strength I'd found in myself. Grateful that I had learned what it meant to truly value myself, to recognize my worth without needing anyone else to validate it. I was no longer the woman who clung to a relationship that didn't serve her, who put others' happiness above her own. I was becoming someone stronger, someone more self-assured, someone who knew what she deserved and would never settle for less. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself embracing this new life with open arms. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages, made new ones who brought joy and laughter into my days. I surrounded myself with people who valued me, who lifted me up, who reminded me that I was enough just as I was. Of course, there were moments when the memories crept back in, moments when I'd remember the necklace, the lies, the heartbreak. But each time those thoughts surfaced, I reminded myself of how far I'd come. I was no longer the same person who had once waited, hoping to be chosen, hoping to be enough. I was someone who had chosen herself, who had found strength in her solitude and joy in her own company. One day, I decided to do something symbolic, something that would mark this new chapter in my life. I went to a jeweler and bought myself a new necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small, meaningful pendant. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't expensive, but it was mine. A reminder of the journey I'd taken, of the woman I had become. As I clasped it around my neck, I felt a sense of pride, a feeling of completion. This necklace wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations or promises. It was a symbol of my resilience, of my self-worth, my decision to live life on my own terms. And as I looked in the mirror, I realized something beautiful. I was no longer haunted by the past. The pain, the betrayal, they were still a part of my story, but they no longer defined me. I had built something stronger, something lasting, a sense of peace, a life that was finally wholly mine. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free to dream, to hope, to love. This time, with a heart that was whole, not waiting for anyone else to complete it. Months had passed since I'd last seen him, since I'd walked away from the life I thought I needed. In that time, I'd grown in ways I hadn't thought possible. The wounds had started to heal, and in their place was a quiet resilience, a strength I hadn't known I was capable of. I began waking up each morning with a renewed sense of purpose, excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. My days were filled with things I loved, things I'd always wanted to do but had once set aside. I started traveling, exploring places I'd only dreamed of, finding beauty in the world and in the freedom I had reclaimed. Each new experience felt like a small victory, a piece of myself reclaimed. One evening, while sitting by the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, I found myself reflecting on everything I had been through. The pain, the betrayal, it all seemed distant now, like a story that had once held me captive, but no longer had power over me. I was no longer defined by the past. I was defined by the strength I had found to rise above it. I thought about the people who had come into my life since then, the friends who had supported me, the strangers who had become kindred spirits, each one teaching me something new about myself and the world. I realized that I was no longer searching for someone else to make me feel complete. I was whole on my own, fulfilled in a way I hadn't been in a long time. There were still moments when I'd think of him, wonder what he was doing, if he ever thought about me, if he regretted what he'd done. But those thoughts no longer carried the weight they once did. I didn't need closure from him, didn't need answers or apologies. I had found closure within myself, had forgiven him not for his sake but for mine, to free myself from the shadows of the past. I had come to realize that my happiness, my worth, wasn't something anyone else could give me. It was something I had found within, a quiet but unshakable confidence that I could handle whatever life threw at me. I was no longer the woman who waited, who sacrificed her dreams for someone else's approval. I was someone who had taken control of her own life, someone who knew what she deserved and wasn't afraid to demand it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I whispered a promise to myself, to continue living boldly, to never settle for anything less than what I truly deserved. I would fill my life with joy, with adventure, with people who saw my worth and valued me for who I was. I would move forward, not with bitterness or regret, but with a heart open to all the beauty the world had to offer. This was my life, my story, and for the first time, I was writing it on my own terms. As I got up to leave, I looked back at the ocean one last time, feeling a sense of gratitude, not for the hurt I'd endured, but for the strength it had revealed within me. I walked away from the beach that night with a smile, feeling lighter, free, and ready for whatever lay ahead. Because I knew now, without a doubt, that I was enough, strong, whole, and complete on my own. In the weeks that followed, I found myself embracing life in ways I never had before. Each day felt like a new chapter, an open page waiting to be filled with moments that were solely mine. There was a freedom in knowing that my story wasn't tied to anyone else's choices, that my happiness wasn't dependent on someone else's validation. I was building a life that reflected who I truly was, and with each passing day, I felt more like the person I was always meant to be. One afternoon, as I walked through the city, I found myself drawn to a small bookstore tucked away on a quiet street. It was the kind of place I'd always loved but rarely visited. I wandered through the aisles, breathing in the familiar scent of paper and ink, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the silence. I picked up a journal from one of the shelves, its cover a simple deep blue. As I flipped through the empty pages, I felt a spark, a quiet thrill that I hadn't felt in a long time. This journal would be for me, a place to capture my thoughts, my dreams, my journey. It would be my reminder that I was the author of my own story, that I could create a life filled with meaning, joy, and purpose. As I made my way home, clutching the journal, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past, with all its pain and heartbreak, had taught me invaluable lessons. It had shown me the depths of my own resilience, my capacity for growth, and the strength that comes from choosing myself. I thought back to everything I'd been through, to the person I was when it all began. She had been hopeful, giving, perhaps even naive. But now I was different, stronger, wiser. I was no longer defined by someone else's affection or validation. I was living for myself, free to pursue my dreams and create a life that reflected who I truly was. That night, I sat down with the journal, pen in hand, and wrote my first entry. I poured out my heart, capturing the highs and lows, the lessons, the gratitude for this new beginning. And as I wrote, I realized that I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. I had faced my darkest moments, and I had come out the other side stronger than ever. I closed the journal, feeling a quiet confidence that I hadn't known before. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I would face it with grace, resilience, and a heart full of self-worth. Because for the first time, I was truly in love, with myself, with the life I was creating, and with the endless possibilities that lay before me. This was my new chapter, and I was ready to embrace it fully, with open arms and an open heart.